Nixon now, Nixon now.
Republicans convened August 22, also in Miami. Apparently, one of the few present with misgivings about the whole affair was California Congressman Paul McCloskey.
What could lose the election for the Republican Party is the image of the party as being controlled by the White House, being controlled by big business, by being controlled by power from the top. And everything in this convention has indicated the hand of the White House, the platform being drafted 3 weeks in advance, nobody ever seeing the platform until the subcommittees met, and even then only being allowed to look at it. None of us who testified being allowed to even see the platform. All of these things indicate an image that is so heavy-handed and so harsh that I'm afraid we can lose this election.
Outside the hall, again, there were protesters and young people, but this time the mood was sullen. War veterans and a group of American Nazis tried to block the entrances to the hall to keep the delegates from entering. Police Chief Rocky Pomerantz outsmarted them all by blocking the nearby streets with buses, nose to tail, and keeping all who approached under surveillance. As the platform was discussed, the delegates came to the usual Indian plank. This voice was heard from the Utah delegation.
Mr. Chairman, fellow delegates,
Peter McDonald, a Navajo Indian. Party unity was the watchword, to the point where President Nixon was introduced by his old rival, Governor Nelson Rockefeller.
It is my great honor to nominate Richard Nixon for re-election as the next President of the United States.
The vote for Richard Nixon is 1,347. The vote for Paul McCloskey is 1, and therefore I declare the nominee of the Republican Party for President of the United States, President Richard Nixon.
Our opponents at their convention rejected many of the great principles of the Democratic Party. To those millions who have been driven out of their home in the Democratic Party, we say, come home. We say, come home not to another party, but we say, come home to the great principles we Americans believe in together. I ask everyone listening to me tonight, Democrats, Republicans, Independents, to join our new majority, not just in the cause of winning an election, but in achieving a hope that mankind has had since the beginning of civilization. Let us build a peace that our children and all the children of the world can enjoy for generations to come.
The climax was engineered like a TV special. When it was all over, Mr. Agnew admitted there were no surprises in this convention.
I guess everybody has moments of insecurity from time to time, but I never did really feel that I was in deep trouble, you might say, as far as the selection was concerned.
Competing with the convention, and throughout the month of August, this story was featured almost every day on the front page of the New York Times.
In August, we were in the midst of more than just the pennant races in baseball. There was an event of world magnitude in a city uncommon to followers of sports or news, Reykjavik, Iceland. The World Chess Championship was underway, or so people thought, but as time went on, it was apparent that the world was following two distinct chess matches, one involving the moves of Bobby Fischer, the American challenger who bewildered everyone, including his opponent, champion Boris Spassky of Russia, by his failure to show up, his excessive demands, his peculiar behavior. But Fischer must have known what he was doing. Losing the first game and forfeiting the second, Fischer calmed down and crushed Spassky to win the 24-game series and to become the first American to be crowned world chess champion.
During the summer, we became aware of another trouble spot in the world, this time Uganda, which was ruled by a military dictator, General Idi Amin. This was a vindictive decree that all Ugandans of Asian origin must leave the country. By September, eyewitness reports began to come from Uganda itself.
While coming from Kampala to Entebbe, there was a lot of checking. Between 21 miles from Kampala to Entebbe, I think there were 6 times checking, And we had to stop after 2-3 miles from Kampala to Entebbe. And they started, most of the people, they started stripping them also.
Some 30,000 of these refugees held British passports, and by the year's end, most of these had found their way to Britain, which was already suffering from chronic unemployment. Early in the year, a new federal election act had demanded disclosure of every campaign contributor of more than $100 after April 7. By September, Democrats were accusing Republicans of irregularities and of soliciting big money before the deadline. The charge came from John Gardner of Common Cause.
In recent months, citizens have been treated to several highly questionable instances of huge sums flowing to the president's political campaign, while government favors flowed in the opposite direction. Perhaps the instances were all coincidental. The way to dispel the aura of mystery and suspicion is to bring all the facts out into the open. That is the purpose of our suit.
The Watergate scandal was still widening, and Senator McGovern called for a top-level investigation.
I would like to see somebody like the former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Justice Warren, handling this investigation, or Lee Rankin. Both of these men are Republicans, but both of them are men who would command the respect of Republicans and Democrats alike. This is what it seemed to me is missing. The president treats this as a kind of a caper. He talked about it in one of his press conferences as the work of an overzealous underling. Well, it's more than that. It's an apparent crime. That kind of crime has some people in the penitentiary.
The hit of the fall TV season was Bridget Loves Bernie, a comedy in the tradition of A.B.'s Irish Rose, said to have 30 million viewers. Followers of Peter Falk were charmed by his role as the down-to-earth detective Columbo on the show of the same name. And on NBC, the series America, hosted by Alastair Cook, an Englishman, won wide praise as a quality show. Best Broadway reviews in the fall went to Butley, with Alan Bates. Down in Washington, the Price Board held hearings in September to study Detroit's request for a higher price on cars. Ralph Nader defended the consumer.
When the inevitable auto price increases are sought next month, the Commission should reverse its present policy and make full disclosure of all the auto company data, and then conduct meaningful open public hearings that will truly protect the interests of the American consumer. As I mentioned earlier, the law provides the Commission with the discretion to do just that.
The increase was not granted by Christmas Eve. Throughout September, government spending was a major topic, as Congress contemplated the price tags on welfare, ecology, education, Social Security, urban renewal, housing, and foreign aid legislation. Senator McGovern made this statement.
Republican leadership since 1969 has now run up an accumulated deficit of $80 billion. That just happens to be 1/5 of the entire national debt accumulated ever since the days of George Washington. What do you think they would say about Democrats if we had that kind of a miserable record of fiscal and economic mismanagement?
Campaigning out in the boondocks, Sergeant Shriver scaled the figures down to the individual voter's pocketbook.
Hamburgers gone up 25%. Hot dogs are up 15%. What did? Chicken has gone up. What? Soup is up. I'll tell you something. Pretzels are up 12%. Bread is up. And what's worse, beer is up 22%.
On just about every subject, the 1972 campaign was notable for acrimony. While Watergate hearings continued, this exchange took place.
I've read about it in history. It was called the Scandal-A-Day Administration. And if we let this Nixon-Agnew team have another 4 years, I think they'll make Warren G. Harding look like a Sunday school teacher before they get through. If we have ever had in the history of this country a special interest administration that was bought and paid for lock, stock, and barrel by selfish, powerful special interests, it's the Nixon-Agnew administration.
Well, let me put it this way.
The Vice President.
Burning ambition, coupled with the prospect of defeat, supersedes rationality. Never in our history has there been a poorer climate for the cultivation of corruption than there is in America today. So I think the kind of thing that Senator McGovern said is really a reckless allegation.
In September, Henry Kissinger returned from Moscow and said to reporters,
"The only alternative is to negotiate on a basis that is just to both sides. The issue of Vietnam will be settled finally in negotiations between us and our allies and the North Vietnamese and their allies, so that the ultimate solution of the Vietnam problem is not being sought by us in Moscow or Peking or any other capital, but in the negotiations that are now going on in Paris."
Americans wondered how many more months. What gave September its place in history was, of course, the Olympics. In Munich, the Games seemed plagued from the start. Bob Seagram, pole vaulter, was the victim of a last-minute international ruling which took away the pole he had used for a year. He had to use a new one and lost to Wolfgang Nordquist of East Germany. Seagram hinted that it was politics.
We upset the Europeans when we had 3 men over 18 feet in our Olympic trials, and somehow that didn't seem fair to them, I think, and they wanted to do something to stop us, and so the first thing that came to their mind, they've been hearing us talk about new poles, well, outlaw the new pole.
Rick DeMont, swimmer, was disqualified from the 1,500-meter competition because of his asthma medicine. Track star Jim Ryan's comeback was ruined by a mishap in the trials.
I felt that I was running a very smart race from the standpoint of not getting in traffic, and the next thing I knew, I was on the ground trying to recover my senses and get back up.
Eddie Hart and Raymond Robinson, both favored in the 100-meter sprint, missed the race because Coach Stan Wright gave them the wrong starting time. And later in the meet, Vince Matthew and Wayne Collette, two black runners, won the 400-meter race, but were banned from all future Olympics competition because of behavior in the winner's circle, which the committee considered arrogant. Matthews explained it to reporters.
Before I got here and got the gold medal, I had to go through a lot that other quarter milers and other athletes. I mean, other athletes could have gone through more, but I went through what I figured wasn't necessary. So if there was anything that didn't look like maybe the ordinary happy athlete, then maybe they should check some of the past press clippings that have been put out on me.
And finally, the U.S. basketball team was denied a gold medal because of a single point scored by the Soviet team in the last 2 seconds, casting serious doubt on the official timekeepers. The coach was, to put it mildly, indignant.
We thought we had 1 second to play. The ball game was over, then we're told they got 3 seconds to play. Well, if you viewed 1 second, then you shouldn't put but 2 back on the clock, should you? He goes down to the floor with both feet, comes up to shoot the basketball. There's no damn way that he could possibly got the shot off, and besides that was a very, very funny call.
If there was a single star in the Olympics, it was Golden Boy Mark Spitz. Spitz won 7 gold medals, which had never been done before in any Olympic competitions. After the first 5, he tried to share the glory.
I am very thrilled, I guess you could say, that I accomplished what I have, but I was only 1/4 of what it took to get the gold medal, the 5th one. If it wasn't for the other 3 boys, then I wouldn't have had the 5th one, nor would have they had theirs, and we all got together and tried to do our best.
Then tragedy struck the Olympics, and all events were stopped when Arab terrorists of the Black September group broke into the quarters of the Israeli team. 2 men were gunned down and 9 hostages were taken to a nearby airport, where police closed in. All the hostages died. Would the games continue? There was doubt, until Avery Brundage, president of the IOC, stepped to the center of the stadium.
We declare today a day of mourning, and will continue all the events 1 day later than originally scheduled.
There were many angry and heartbroken statements following the tragedy. In New York, an unusual and moving funeral service was held, spoken and sung by civil rights leader Bayard Rustin.
The Jewish prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Amos, like our black prophet Martin Luther King, made clear that injury to what one considered his enemy was in fact injury to himself and all mankind. I would hope, therefore, that all Jews could take heart at this moment of sadness in knowing that the Jewish prophets have not yet failed, that the words of the prophets are still being revealed in truth. For the millions of black men and the millions of Christians who stand firm in this moment with Jews, I would like to share with you the song that we sing at the time of death.
Death ain't nothing but a robber, don't you see? Death ain't nothing but a robber, don't you see? Death came to my house, he didn't stay long. I looked in the bed and my brothers were gone. Death, you ain't nothing but a robber, don't you see?
Throughout the year, the Middle East was barely at peace and very nearly at war. During the last week of September, Hanoi made good its promise to release 3 prisoners of war. They were met in Hanoi by relatives and by a committee of anti-war activists. The most verbal was Lieutenant J.G. Norris A. Charles, the only black man of the 3.
If you really want to bring these men home, you can do it. If you really want to end the war, you can do it. Some of the men that are left have a great deal of faith and hope in you, the American people. I call on you to help me in helping to bring these men home.
Lieutenant Mark Gartley.
During the years, you ask yourself many questions in this situation, and one of the big questions I said is why? Why are we involved in Vietnam? And I've heard all the reasons, pro and con, and I still have a question.
And Air Force Major Edward Elias.
A lot of people that I left that I have very strong feelings for, and I'm also thinking about that airplane out there. It's going to carry me home before very long. So I just want to say I'm glad again, and I'll see you back in the United States.
After nearly a year of study, the Attica Commission reported its findings on the 1971 riot that took 43 lives. No one involved appeared blameless, from Governor Rockefeller on down. Chairman Robert B. McKay made this discouraging observation.
It's perfectly apparent that change can come about. It's equally apparent that change will not come about unless the attention of the public focuses upon this issue. As I said, that there are changes that can be made. They're costly. They require effort. They require devotion. And none of that will happen unless the public gets itself interested enough to deal with the legislature, deal with the executive branch, and leave the prisons unneglected. I think all present indications are that the public is not interested.
A movie cult took shape in 1972, the black action movies, said by many critics to be heavy on violence, sex, and racial stereotypes. There was Shaft's Big Score, Slaughter, Hammer, Comeback Charleston Blue, and Superfly, which grossed about $1 million a week after its release. Then there was Lady Sings the Blues, in which singer Diana Ross played Billie Holiday, an altogether fine film. Well, September was baseball month.
In baseball, Vida Blue was a washout in '72, but the September races were far closer than a year ago. In the American League particularly, the Oakland A's fought off the upstart Chicago White Sox in the Western Division. 4 teams wrestled in the East before the aging Detroit Tigers edged the Boston Red Sox by a half game. That strike caused the imbalance in the schedule. In the National League, the Pittsburgh Pirates in the East and the Cincinnati Reds in the West had little resistance. October's playoffs were unquestionably the most exciting and dramatic since their inception. The Reds beat the Pirates as Bob Moose threw a wild pitch to allow the winning run to score in the final inning of the deciding game. And in the American League, the A's, sporting green and gold uniforms and 1890 mustaches, downed the Tigers in the 5th and deciding game to advance to the World Series against Cincinnati. The series went the full 7 games, and Charlie Finley's A's upset the Reds to cap a colorful, animated season. The hero of the World Series was an unlikely figure. His name, Gene Tennis, whose name will be etched in World Series annals now.
Tennis hit the two-run home run. Nolan throws him a curve, and he lines it down the line very deep inside the flagpole, and it is a home run. Gene Tennis, who went 0 for 15 and then won the playoff game against Detroit, hit a home run in the second inning off a fastball, hit a hanging Gary Nolan curve, and has lined his second home run in 2 times at bat in his first World Series.
Tennis tied a series record, and the A's were world champions.
October may go down in history as veto month, indicating that the president and Congress were further apart than the A's and the Tigers. The welfare bill was one example, a veto which brought this angry comment from Senator Ribicoff, sponsor of the most liberal welfare bill under consideration. The major issues were a guaranteed income and mandatory work for welfare recipients.
It means that welfare reform is dead. The welfare mess will continue. Our welfare rolls will rise about 15% a year. The taxpayers will moan and groan, and the problems will remain with us ad infinitum.
Then there was the veto of a far-reaching and costly water pollution bill. This angered its sponsor, Senator Muskie.
Well, the fact is that this water bill represents 2 years of hard work by the Congress to help the president meet that commitment. And in an election year, he decided that the rhetoric of tax and spending was more politically rewarding than a commitment, a real commitment to cleaning up the water.
The president was defended by his aide, John Ehrlichman.
I think there's a real danger that the American people might be led to listen to the opposition, who undoubtedly will attempt to demagogue this and will attempt to try and persuade people that the president somehow or other is in favor of dirty water. Nothing could be further from the truth. The bill, which finally after 2.5 years has been enacted by the Congress, is some $18 billion over the president's budget.
This veto was overridden by a stubborn Congress. There was extended debate on a limit to federal spending and on the perennial issue of busing. Senator Howard Baker reported on the president's position.
I can recall many visits to the White House, but I can recall no visit in my 6 years in the United States Senate when the president spoke more forcefully his position on a particular legislative provision than he has in support of this anti-busing bill. He made it clear that by having this meeting that he wanted the Senate to know of his position. He's indicated that the staff of the president will contact the members of the Senate to make sure they understand the point of view of the administration. This seems to me to be a very substantial assist to those of us who are opposed to busing and a very material assistance in the business of trying to order the legislative program.
The bill went through. Another important piece of legislation was the revenue sharing plan. Vice President Agnew extolled the bill, and Governor Rockefeller applauded.
This bill and the others that have been proposed can reverse the flow of power back toward the people again. It can give us the chance we need to renew state and local government and to relieve state and local taxes. This document can change the very ground rules of our political system.
I believe that future generations are going to look back on this day and on this bill and on President Richard Nixon, and they're going to say, this was when America reaffirmed its belief in state and local government.
In October, Republican campaign manager Clark McGregor angrily attacked the Washington Post for its coverage of the Watergate affair.
Unproven charges by McGovern aides or Senator Muskie about alleged campaign disruptions that occurred more than 6 months ago are invariably given treatment normally accorded declarations of war, while proven facts of opposition-incited disruptions of the president's campaign are buried deep inside the paper. When McGovern headquarters in California was used as a boiler room to rally hardcore anti-war militants to confront the president, that was apparently of no significance to a newspaper that has dispatched a platoon of reporters to investigate charges that somebody sent 200 pizzas to a Muskie rally last spring.
Post editor Benjamin Bradley countered.
Time will judge between Clark McGregor's press releases and the Washington Post's reporting of the various activities of the Committee for the Re-election of the President. For now, it's enough to say that not a single fact contained in the investigative reporting by this newspaper about these activities has been successfully challenged.
Democrats viewed the Watergate bugging as just one incident in a Republican campaign of espionage and sabotage and a new low in dirty politics. Also in October, a death occurred, which touched many people. The Reverend Jesse Jackson, Chicago civil rights leader, spoke at the funeral of Jackie Robinson.
Pain, misery, and travail have lost. Jackie is saved. His enemies can leave him alone. His body will rest, but his spirit and his mind and his impact are perpetual and as affixed to human progress as are the stars in the heaven, the shine in the sun and the glow in the moon.
Mostly, October was the month before election. But as the campaign rhetoric reached its climax, it was interrupted on October 26 by this statement from Henry Kissinger.
We believe that peace is at hand. We believe that an agreement is within sight based on the May 8th proposals of the President and some adaptations of our January 25th proposal, which is just to all parties. It is inevitable that in a war of such complexity, that there should be occasional difficulties in reaching a final solution. But we believe that by far the longest part of the road has been traversed.
The world seemed to hold its breath. Had the months of secret talk succeeded after all? What did it matter if peace came on election eve, just as long as it came? And the terms seemed reasonable. A ceasefire, exchange of prisoners, elections, and international military supervision. Hanoi named a deadline of October 31 for signing, but nothing happened. Nothing was signed, and the war did not end. The terms had called for President Tew to step down, which he refused to do. And George McGovern spoke for many Americans.
Why do we wait until the closing days of an election campaign to do something we should have done 4 years ago? Why, Mr. Nixon, was it necessary to kill another 20,000 young Americans in this war before we ended it? What did you gain by killing or wounding or driving out of their homes 6 million people, most of them in South Vietnam, by this incredible bombing that has gone on for the last 4 years?
There were more secret meetings, more complications, and then it was Election Day.
I want every single one of you to remember and never forget it, that if we pushed the day of peace just one day closer, then every minute and every hour and every bone-crushing effort in this campaign was worth the entire sacrifice.
This will be a great victory, depending upon what we do with it. In other words, we win elections not simply for the purpose of beating the other party or the other person, but to get the opportunity to do good things for our country. And the next 4 years will be the time that we will try to make ourselves worthy of this victory. I will simply say, in that connection, it was a great victory. But the greater the victory, the greater the responsibility, the greater the opportunity. And we're going to try to meet it, dedicating ourselves to those great goals that I've discussed at such great length, building that world of peace, of real peace with honor throughout the world, and building at home the new prosperity and the progress for all Americans that is so close to our hearts.
When it was all over, Sid Davis, chief of the Group W Washington Bureau, offered this interpretation.
It was a year of exploding theories and myths. You were told Senator Muskie had it all sewed up with hardly a need for a nominating convention. Of course. The American voters were fed up with the war, and if President Nixon didn't end it by Election Day, he'd surely be in serious trouble. Certainly. Wasn't it a cinch that everybody under 30 years of age, the youth vote, if you please, would go massively against the president? Absolutely. And that would be particularly true if somehow Muskie faltered and by some miracle, little known, untraditional, George McGovern would be the nominee. The essence of the postmortems in primary after primary was that an unpredictable, new, invisible current was sweeping America, pushing for change. A fresh breeze was blowing. Right? Wrong. By convention time, the pundits were returned to the reality that traditional politics was still the name of the game. George McGovern won the Democratic nomination the same way politicians have won it for decades. He chose border state Catholic Thomas Eagleton as his running mate, using the familiar formula of Democratic nominees before him, and he did it the same way with Eagleton's successor, Sergeant Shriver. McGovern would later abandon what remained of his new politics, which had scared many people half to death. President Nixon drew a page from Franklin Roosevelt's presidential campaigns, using the White House as his podium. With help from his opponent, Nixon made his opponent the issue. Mr. Nixon rallied the country to his own side on the war and capitalized on an election eve peace blitz, which would later sour. He shattered McGovern's hopes of victory through the newly enfranchised youth vote. The president won youth support by reducing the draft and eliminating Vietnam service from their future. When it was all over, Mr. Nixon had won a very respectable share of the young people, organized labor, and the unemployed as well. His shrewd handling of the busing and welfare issues won him votes both north and south. Charges of Republican political sabotage, even grand jury action against Republican-paid operatives indicted for wiretapping and burglarizing Democratic headquarters did not seem to faze an electorate suspicious of all politicians. But even for Mr. Nixon, basking in abundant plurality, there were signs of caution ahead. Surveys showed his mandate as much McGovern's creation as his own, and the majority in Congress was not his. So, as the events of 1972 fade toward another quadrennial, and reformists talk of change, faceless others yet to be identified are quietly examining delegate rosters, electoral vote strategy, and the weather forecasts for New Hampshire in the late winter of '76.
In the 54 days that remained of 1972, gaiety was hardly the dominant theme, except perhaps for Chancellor Willy Brandt, who won an election on a platform of improved relations with both East and West. Senator John Tunney of California was in Germany for a NATO conference at that time.
This is a very healthy thing, and I think that Brandt's victory represents a solidification, in Germany at least, of the attitudes that many of us have that we ought to improve relations with the East.
Canada also had an election, but the results were indecisive, and Premier Trudeau stayed in office with less than a majority. Way back in July, a Supreme Court ruling had overturned the time-honored concept of journalistic immunity, that a reporter need not reveal his sources of information. Around Thanksgiving, KFWB's Bill Jenkins interviewed Bill Farr, a newsman who had covered the Manson case in 1970, and refused to reveal the source of some information about the future plans of the so-called Manson family.
This whole series of rulings, not just in my case, but in regard to certain other newsmen, may stultify the inclination of people to come forth with information that the public really should know about. Examples involving, let's say, corruption in government or organized crime, where if you can't protect someone from being fired, if they give you information that would show corruption in government, as an example, or if you couldn't protect someone from physical harm, if they told you about certain organized crime or mafia activities, the public would be harmed by not getting that information.
Farr went to prison December 1, with no prospect of an early release. Another case involved Jim Mitchell, KFWB reporter who had done an investigative series on bail bondsmen in Los Angeles. The district attorney's office wanted the outtakes, which were refused, and a subpoena was issued. At the end of the year, the case was still up in the air, but just before Christmas, station manager Arthur Shriver had this to say.
If now you are going to be called before a grand jury and asked about our conversation and play that recording, in my opinion, you're being asked to be an extension or an arm of the law.
According to some observers, the Supreme Court ruling was part of a campaign to whittle away freedom of the press and other cherished First Amendment rights. Given his substantial majority vote, the president made a number of dramatic changes in his cabinet, mostly in the direction of conservatism. The new Secretary of Labor was Peter Brennan, a New York labor figure who was immediately questioned on the matter of wage controls.
There Things that are done hurriedly, and I'm not trying to second-guess the people that did it, but I personally was opposed to it then. I'm opposed to it now as a means of trying to bring labor to their heels.
Controls, you mean, generally?
Well, controls a suspending of any law that would interfere with the rights of the workers. And I'm hoping that we're working with the president we can prevent this in the future.
The president also appointed Caspar Weinberger Secretary of HEW, gave George Shultz an important Treasury post, and appointed Elliot Richardson as Secretary of Defense. Richardson had held many government posts, all of them honorably.
The last time I served in any job as long as 3 years was when I was Assistant Secretary of HEW. And the average duration of any job I've had since then has been 2 years. And every time at the 2-year point, I feel that I really know what the job is, I know what needs to be done, or I think I do. I have a sense of what I'd like to accomplish and a feeling that the foundations have been laid, and then comes along an offer that I have not been able to refuse. Thank you very much.
When Thanksgiving came, Americans had a lot to be thankful for, but peace in Indochina was not one of them. One complication after another developed in Paris, demanding the continued presence of Dr. Kissinger.
My instructions are to stay for as long as is useful and to conduct the negotiations in a spirit of conciliation, moderation, and goodwill.
In London, the royal family celebrated an important anniversary.
I think everybody really will concede that on this, of all days, I should begin my speech with the words, my husband and I. We, and by that I mean both of us, are most grateful for the kind and thoughtful way in which you have expressed the city's loyalty and affection. When the bishop was asked what he thought about sin, he replied with simple conviction that he was against it. If I am asked today what I think about family life after 25 years of marriage, I can answer with equal simplicity and conviction, I am for it.
In Ireland, the sorry chain of events continued. Murder, retaliation, and more murder. By December 1, the IRA had been censured by Protestants and Catholics alike, as well as the government of the Irish Republic to the south. A Northern Irish Catholic politician, Paddy Devlin, felt this way.
They recognize that their efforts to create war have faded away, and I would think rather than have themselves completely defeated, that their attempt at this point in time, while they're still in business with their rocket launchers, to have a truce or to work out some peace arrangements with Mr. Heath and Mr. Whitelaw.
We also noted in November the death of Ezra Pound. The announcement that Life magazine would cease publication in 1973 added a gloomy note to the winter months. A startling headline in late November announced that, according to writer Ladislav Farego, Martin Bormann was alive. Jay Bushinsky in Israel to Michael Bar-Zohar, an expert in the field of post-war hunts for war criminals.
I think he might be alive. Anyway, I'm sure he didn't die in Berlin at the end of the Second World War. And if he is alive, I made quite an investigation about that in South America. The last time I heard about it, he was supposed to be living either in Brazil, Paraguay, or Argentine, close to the Parana River, which he could cross every time that there was a danger of being discovered by somebody else.
Somehow, it all seemed unlikely. The last of the moon flights, Apollo 17, was launched on December 6. There was a 2-hour delay, but the nighttime launch was one of the year's spectaculars.
7, ignition sequence started. All engines are started. We have ignition, 2, 1, 0. We have a liftoff. We have a liftoff, and it's lighting up the area. It's just like daylight here at Kennedy Space Center as the Saturn V is moving off the pad. It has now cleared the tower.
Tower, yaw, complete. We're in a roll, Bob.
Roger, Gino. Looking great. Thrust on all 5 engines.
Okay, babe, it's looking good here. Roll is complete. We are pitching.
Astronaut Gene Cernan and geologist Jack Schmitt spent 22 hours exploring the surface of the moon and discovered a new phenomenon: orange soil. Ron Evans stayed in the command module. From launch to splashdown, it seemed like a perfect flight. Despite this from Jack Schmitt.
One complaint. Somebody slighted me on a caramel candy and Neil C.
Badge. We'll start an investigation.
Yes, it was not there.
In mid-December, New York Police Commissioner Patrick Murphy announced a theft which shocked even the most cynical.
Approximately 57 pounds of contraband heroin seized by the police department in 1962 has been stolen. At this time, we do not know how the theft occurred or when it occurred. A fictional account of the original case involving the seizure has since become well known to the public. From the time of the initial seizure of approximately 73 pounds of heroin on February 24th, 1962, through September 1969, the contraband heroin, possibly as a result of the publicity surrounding the seizure and subsequent trial, was moved on a number of occasions and has been handled by several public agencies. It is tragically apparent that the department's procedures for the control of confiscated narcotics have been totally inadequate.
Before the year ended, about 300 pounds of heroin and cocaine would be unaccounted for, in what the New York Times said had all the earmarks of an inside job. In the early hours of December 26, President Harry S. Truman, age 88, died after 22 days of serious illness. It brought back a rush of memories: the end of the Great War, the bitterly controversial A-bomb, the surprise election of 1948, Korea, and the dismissal of General MacArthur. We remembered his joyful address to the infant United Nations some 27 years ago.
Oh, what a great day this can be in history. The Charter of the United Nations, which you are now signing, is a solid structure upon which we can build for a better world. Out of all the arguments and disputes and different points of view, a way was found to agree. We have tested the principle of cooperation in this war and have found that it works.
We remembered his feisty humor.
They want us to shut ourselves off from the rest of the world and abandon our friends and our allies. All right, I'm doing it.
And we recalled a time when a reporter many years ago had questioned him about an epitaph.
I've tried my best to give the nation everything I had in me. And I always quote one epitaph, which is on a tombstone in the cemetery at Tombstone, Arizona. And it said, "Here lies Jack Williams. He done his damnedest."
The man from Missouri's claim to greatness seemed to be growing with each passing year. On December 23rd, news from Nicaragua that the capital city had been almost totally destroyed by a violent earthquake. Estimate of the loss of life reached 7,000 before the year's end. On Monday before Christmas, a massive bombing of Hanoi was ordered, aimed at forcing the North Vietnamese to return to the peace table. Reports began to come in that destruction in Hanoi was overwhelming. Losses were heavy, too. 27 planes down in December. Peace, the phantom of 1972, seemed more remote than at any time during the year, and Richard Nixon, for all his talk of peace, had not yet kept this all-important promise. The final hours of the year witnessed a plane crash in the knee-deep water of the Everglades. 74 dead, 93 survivors. A Coast Guard officer described the lurid scene.
At this point, it's only accessible by helicopter. We're trying to bring in airboats and swamp buggies to pull the people out, bring them out to a roadway where we can use civilian ambulances to bring them to local hospitals. We are also being assisted by the Air Force. They have search and rescue control. At this moment, we have 4 helicopters on scene, one fixed-wing aircraft. Eastern Airlines has flown in a special helicopter with floodlights. There are 6 Air Force helicopters in the air now with paramedics en route to the crash scene.
And just 2 hours before the year ended, a crash off Puerto Rico took the life of Roberto Clemente, the Pittsburgh Pirates star outfielder and the most popular sports figure in Puerto Rico's history. The island was plunged into mourning. Having considered all the milestones, the beginnings and endings, the glory and the grief, as the old year waned, we asked for a perspective of 1972. And as we have done so often during the year, we turn to Group W's senior commentator, Rod McLeish.
1972 seems to have been a year in which great men and governments tidied up old matters and embarked upon precious little that was new. Perhaps the one striking departure from the status quo that prevailed at the beginning of the 70s was the decision of Peking's leaders to receive President Nixon, and/or his decision to go see them. For both the conservative American president and the highly orthodox Marxist leadership of the People's Republic of China, this was a significant new gesture. There was also a modest warming in relations between Washington and Havana. The agreement on hijacking was the expression of more than just a mutual desire to do something about air piracy. It was also an expression of weariness with another frosty status quo. But aside from these, aside from the sudden opening up between North and South Korea, 1972 was a year for tidying up old things and perhaps seeing the failure of old premises. President Nixon's visit to Moscow was another step in a long process of Soviet-American relations that began really with Franklin D. Roosevelt, which chilled through the long years of the Cold War and is now proceeding again under Mr. Nixon and his brilliant deputy, Dr. Henry Kissinger. Even Mr. Nixon's accelerated withdrawal from Vietnam and the aborted year-end talks in Paris and the resuming of the bombing of North Vietnam were extensions of a prior policy enunciated in Mr. Nixon's 1968 presidential campaign. Elsewhere in the world, the bright promise of Bangladesh's initial bloody tearaway from Pakistan became clouded as the leadership of the world's newest nation proved incapable of dealing with the massive problems of economics, jobs, and housing. In the Middle East, Egypt's long relationship with the Soviet Union went sour, and Israel's with the United States wasn't in the best of shape either. There were rumors that with his re-election, Mr. Nixon had positioned himself to pressure Israel for a settlement based on the time-worn and often rejected idea of Arab promises of Israel's security in return for an Israeli withdrawal from lands occupied in the 1967 war. Even that possible development lacked originality. None of this meant that the world was devoid of newness. Indeed, the three most historically significant events of the year bespoke something so new that no one was certain of its meaning. In Canada, the United States, and the Federal Republic of Germany, there were national elections. The outcome of the one in the United States was predicted, at least its presidential phase was. But the results in Canada and the Federal Republic of Germany defied prediction. Prime Minister Trudeau thought he would lose seats in the House of Commons, but nowhere near the number he actually lost. Willy Brandt, the Reichschancellor of West Germany, thought he would win, but not by the wide margin that he actually won. These election results seemed to cast the problem of newness in sharp relief toward the end of 1972. Brandt's success was related directly to the fact that he had tried a new approach to the wearying, repetitive old East-West stalemate. Trudeau's failure could be traced to the fact that despite the Canadian Prime Minister's youth and bright promise, he had failed to solve old problems, especially those of the Canadian economy, with innovative new policies. The American election's relationship to the lack of newness was murkier. Mr. Nixon won largely because his opponent did promise new things, but the wrong sorts of new things, apparently in the wrong way, and George McGovern was simply the wrong man. The vote ran heavily against him, personally, but not against the Democratic Party, which gained in the Senate, suffered smaller losses than predicted in the House, and ended one-up in governorships. A study to be published on January 7th by the Washington social research firm Potomac Associates shows that the Americans as a whole finished 1972 in a condition of relative self-satisfaction. The book, derived from polling on key social questions, indicated that a majority of Americans, black and white, think that their own individual conditions have improved, while the general condition of the nation had deteriorated. In a priority chart of public spending preferences, defense ranked low. The environment ranked high. So did crime prevention. But, despite simplified political appeals to law and order, the bulk of the Americans still see crime as the product of inferior social conditions. Spending to improve the education of poor children ranked high, but paradoxically, spending to improve the lives of blacks in general ranked low. The cumulative portrait of America that emerged from that and other studies, and from the election results, indicated a desire for newness, improvement, and change, but an elusive definition of what changes should be made. Obviously, the old political platitudes about world leadership in weaponry and technology, about law and order as ends in themselves, about global tension and the maintenance of sketchily defined old values, were not very appealing in a mass sense. The United States pauses, waiting for something new as 1972 ends. It waits for plausible new directions. But since no one has yet defined those directions, their advent is stalled. The search for acceptable newness in America will be the dominant theme for the new year and the rest of the decade to come.
Newness notwithstanding, on New Year's Eve, many Americans did what they had always done. They listened to Guy Lombardo. Hopeful for an encouraging note, Stan Bernard got him on the phone.
Actually, there's always been some sort of a cloud hanging over people, but I think they look forward to the new year, each new year, as maybe this is the year that everything's going to improve. So I think that we're all hopeful each year that the next year will bring something a little better than we've had before.
And that, for better or for worse, was 1972. This is Gary LaPierre.